also find yourself overwhelmed with the workload that you have on, wondering, one, how you can get it finished, and two, is it all worth it in the end? Sitting down with my business partner, Jodi Barrow, in this week's episode of Tea Time with Talent Acquisition, we take a step back from the day-to-day task of recruitment and we explore goal setting on a professional level and a personal level. We segue into motivating ourselves through the highs and lows of the talent acquisition job and explore coping mechanisms that she has learned through years of practice and therapy to bring to you an episode that you do not want to miss. Here is what we've got coming up for you.
Professionally, it's good to have goals to help you get to that next step, seek that next career progression, maybe reach that new salary goal, but also to become a better peer, a better manager, to learn, to develop professionally and personally. And I find that when I'm doing all of the right things in my personal life, I perform better in my work life. I would be looking at, firstly, what do I need to get to the next step? And have an open conversation with your team member or with your superior manager to discuss what is the company criteria for me to get to that next step. Am I on track with it? What do I need to improve on? Once you've got those areas aligned and clear, you can then start to break down for yourself, but also with your professional manager, how to do that. Set yourself timeframes. More often than not, you get a lot more done when you have a time frame attached to it. Otherwise, it will just be one of those things that go to the bottom of the pile.
Hopefully you stick around for the whole episode. I promise you, you will not regret it. There is so much you could absorb from Jodi's knowledge, so I hope you get just as much out of it, if not more, than I did. Thanks for joining us, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Welcome to Tea Time with Talent Acquisition, the podcast aimed at fostering knowledge and sharing stories within the vibrant talent acquisition community. I'm your host, Eden, and for the next hour or so, I'm going to be joined by someone I've had the great fortune to have known for over 15 years and professionally for the past decade. This individual is an advocate for quality over quantity when it comes to hiring, with an incredible track record, having worked with teams like BCG DV, Volkswagen, and Zalando. Her knowledge is a must here. Exploring beyond the role of a day-to-day recruiter, I'm very excited to peel back the wider aspects of motivations and more specifically, the link between professional and personal goals and how we can use these as drivers to craft what she calls a winner's mindset. So when you're ready, grab your favorite tea or coffee if you prefer, and join me in welcoming today's guest, the founding partner of Peritus Partners, Jodi Barrow. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, and cheers to us.
Cheers to us indeed. Well, I had to speak from genuine truth there. So, and look, I meant every word of it. I am genuinely excited to understand a bit more about your understanding of, winner's mindset and how you've cultivated it, not just obviously in yourself, but for teams, et cetera, et cetera. So before we dive into all of that good stuff, I do like to have, let's call it a icebreaker question. So everybody gets the same question. So from your side, what do you think the biggest struggle is for talent acquisition teams today?
Today, well, I think talent acquisition generally struggle with setting up processes that are quality led and maintaining them at scale. So I guess the balance between, bringing value, but then also replicating that. And I think that's the same internally for organizations building talent acquisition, and then also on the agency side. I think that's a challenge.
Nice. And the reason I start with that is because sometimes these questions kind of link in between all of those sides of things and try and piece together. But the topic you wanted to talk about was winner's mindset, motivation, goal setting, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess set the scene first of all, before we dive into anything specific. Why this? Why do you think it's important to peel back the layer of what we actually do and focus more on this kind of aspect?
Well, I see a lot of people, and actually I guess it does in a way lead from that challenge. Quite often it's hard to retain good people. Sometimes it's challenging for people to continue a career in recruitment because it is quite a high pressured job at times, and it's quite mentally challenging, but without the recognition in some cases. So, I think there's some career paths that are proven and, have a bit of a spotlight on for being very, very high levels of stress. Recruitment's kind of one of those things that, the classic, we fell into it type of position, where it then doesn't mean that people are prepared or equipped to put up with some of the stresses that we get, whether that's from stakeholders, clients, colleagues, management, leaders, you name it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the phrase of falling into it kind of summed up, let's call it 90% of those who work in our field. So the first thing we want to kind of focus on is goal setting. Now, I've worked with you for many, many years, and I would say since we founded Peritus, I've seen it a lot more. Been working closer with you around how you set your goals and how you drive that towards the team as well. So why do you feel personal and professional goal setting is important?
Yeah, I mean, I love goals. I love big goals, short goals, mid goals. I think all goals are important to give you a bit of direction professionally, but also personally for what you want. Because I think that ties back to why you do what you do on a personal level, and also keeps in the bigger picture of what does this mean for your career? What does it mean for the impact and the purpose that you're trying to have in your industry, in your life, I guess.
Why do they link personal and professional goals, or how do they link, shall I say?
Well, yeah, I guess there's an element of purpose to it, but in some cases, well, I think kind of the mood comes into it, right? Generally, day by day, you can't always be giving 100%. You can't always feel 100%, but it kind of gives you your why to what you're doing. And I think professionally, it's good to have goals to help you get to that next step, seek that next career progression, maybe reach that new salary goal, but also to become a better peer, a better manager, to learn, to develop professionally and personally. And I find that when I'm doing all of the right things in my personal life, I perform better in my work life. So actually that's where I think the two come together, is based on your mindset puts you in the right position to perform, not just for your next professional goal, but also to be a better partner, wife, husband, mother, daughter, friend, colleague, brother. Every part of your life is impacted when you do the things that are right for you personally.
So give me an example. How do we go about and set these on a professional level, and relating it back to, I guess, what we're doing in recruitment and talent acquisition?
Okay. Well, maybe actually, I'm guessing she won't mind me using her as an example, but one of our consultants, Amy, that we work with, we try to actually set both of these together. So she comes to me with what her personal targets are for the short, medium and long term. Now, short term can be, just building habits, things like potentially going to the gym or listening to a podcast or watching a YouTube documentary or reading a book or whatever it is. And then the midterm can be something that's achievable, we advise, within sort of 18 months. And then long term is 3 years and beyond. So it kind of then means that this big goal that we want eventually can be broken down into segments, what's more manageable on a day-to-day basis.
So from her example, or when you was, let's take it from an individual contributor perspective first, how are we going to go set a professional goal, or what would we want to be aiming at from our goal perspective?
To set a professional goal, I would, as if I had somebody in the team or even myself as an individual contributor, I would be looking at, firstly, what do I need to get to the next step, and have an open conversation with your team member or with your superior manager to discuss what is the company criteria for me to get to that next step. am I on track with it? What do I need to improve on? Once you've got those areas aligned and clear, you can then start to break down for yourself, but also with your professional manager, how to do that. Set yourself timeframes. More often than not, you get a lot more done when you have a time frame attached to it. Otherwise, it will just be one of those things that go to the bottom of the pile.
Yeah. So do you have an example where you've personally set a goal that's helped you achieve X, Y, and Z? And I guess I'm kind of looking, thinking of someone who's in that position now and going, okay, I've got all this work, I've got these projects to do, I've got these positions to fill, I've got to, work out how we're going to adjust the candidate experience, the diversity inclusion efforts, whatever you name it. They've got a lot on their plate. How can they kind of take a look at their work and go, this is how I'm going to compartmentalize, these are the goals I'm going to focus on? How would we kind of create that process?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Trello. There's many other tools out there, but I generally like Trello. I think it's quite easy to use, where I do exactly that. I break down, this is the project that I'm working on. These are the tasks that I've got to do within that. Now, when and how I start them, I tend to use, and this is actually a coping mechanism I learned from therapy before. So they actually sometimes, and again, it's a lot of other people I'm sure can relate to this, where you've got a ton of work to do, you can kind of get overwhelmed, and you end up having this big long list of things to do. And actually, you, in some cases, because you don't want to forget things, you're adding unnecessary tasks that are not urgent. So you're putting a bit of extra pressure on yourself. So to break that down, I was advised, and I now use a system which is for prioritizing A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. So A is your super urgent, need to get done today, otherwise all hell's going to break loose. B is needs doing, but it could also be done tomorrow, next week, not so urgent. And C is more of a nice to have. So it's something that we've discussed, which probably would be a nice idea to do, but there's no consequences, or it doesn't really impact things if it doesn't happen. Now, obviously, this formula is great for someone like us that's working on our own schedule, and exactly that, putting the pressure on ourselves. Naturally, when you have a manager who's maybe putting some of this pressure onto you, then it's important to firstly set the criteria of what is a priority, potentially using A, B, and C, potentially using that technique, and then discussing it with your manager. You can even use, this task typically takes around 3 hours, or I expect this task to take 2 hours. So then you're kind of moving into time blocking as well. But then you can clearly see, I've got 5 days in the week. If you're working full time, these are the hours that I work. This is the time that I've got allocated to each task. And this is how I've prioritized it. If there's still a whole bunch of tasks that are not done, or not, you can clearly see mapped out at the end of, at the beginning of your week, it's not realistic to do. Take that to your manager and address, look, this is how I've planned it. Where do you think have I made any mistakes, or should anything be amended for the prioritization? If not, can we reassess the timeframes or deadlines that we've got for these topics to make sure that because then you can clearly see that someone's working and have a efficient plan that they can do things. I mean, of course, there's always going to be certain periods of time where you might need to work a few hours outside of the working day, and recruitment isn't for the faint-hearted, and it's also not got the work-life balance that I guess other positions can ask for. But that said, I do think there is still a cut-off point where you need to prioritise yourself to be able to perform better when you are in a professional setting.
I really like that as well. If we take it back from, that ISE level, and this is a little sneak peek, I guess, into a future episode we've got coming up next season. So just a little plug. The guy called Jeffrey Lovejoy is going to be speaking about, has recruitment lost its way? And he talks specifically about projects versus recruitment. And what you're talking about there is like prioritizing what you're being given, and ultimately, do you have enough time in the day to do your actual job versus the extra and added benefits and what's important. So we're looking at, obviously, from the short-term perspective, it's so important I've definitely fallen guilty of it. I mean, you've seen firsthand where I prioritize the wrong things. I've spoken to TA teams who have fallen guilty to it, but because we have so much piling on top of us, we don't know where to kind of start sometimes. So that ABC element is a really nice way of getting, getting yourself back on track on those short-term goals and speaking openly with your manager about, hey, this is what I might need help on, or, this is what I can't take on board. And it's not you just coming with a problem, it's you coming with the solution that this is the plan. This is how I've allocated it.
Yeah, and I think also it's a nice visual for people to see,
Yeah.
why actually I do need to readdress that myself. Sometimes they think,
Mm.
well, you've got everything handled because you're saying yes and you're agreeing to it,
Yeah.
or you're not saying no, which, is something that needs a bit of balance. And I also think it's a skill that you're going to need in the future if you want to progress, is not just time management, but also setting expectations. So I don't think it's something that should be shied away from, or you should feel guilty for having. I think it's realistic.
Yeah. I think ultimately, if the TAs, the HR managers, the recruiters who listen to this podcast, I imagine by now people are saying, okay, I've got my goals. And I think as an industry, we're pretty good at goals. We're either from the external side driven by KPIs, and then kind of we find our way of how to change them into goals. And from the internal, I think we're also pretty good. So I feel like that part is probably covered quite well, but it's the motivation side through peaks and troughs that I think a lot of us, and again myself, putting my hand up on that one, have been guilty of falling either really down when it's bad, and I'm too hyped up when it's good, and probably annoy everyone in the office. Don't get me wrong. So where we're going through when we're going through the mindset aspect, how do we manage that when first of all things are going well? You're hitting your goals, you're doing well, or your team personally are doing well, but maybe others around you aren't feeling it as much. How are we managing our own mindset during that period of time?
Yeah, I think this, I mean, typically when it's going well is the easy part. And I use quotations because sometimes people can get a bit carried away. Sometimes they get a bit of an ego, or they almost forget about when it was tough, or forget about the challenges that they've been through in that moment because everything's going good. And their expectations sort of climb up for other people that are maybe earlier in their career, or are not maybe fully aware of their personal situation. And so, yeah, I think that the first and main point to not become, not dislike, but not become a negative impact to the people around you, is to keep your ego in check. So whether that's through feedback loops with colleagues, with your team, getting other people to do those feedback loops, but also, just I guess having a bit of a grounding. Sometimes that could just be, self-journaling and having a look at, okay, this is what's going well. This is what I need to keep an eye on, and having a real honest conversation with yourself to say, actually, I might have been too harsh on this point, or I might think that this is going well, but there's always risks, right? Even when things are going well, there's always competition. There's always changes. I mean, we've definitely seen it in the last 2 years with COVID, with 3 years with COVID, with the financial economic challenges that are coming through. So things can always change in a heartbeat. I think it's important to stay grounded and to kind of check your ego, but then also to make time to keep learning so that you can stay ahead. Look at what's going on around you in terms of competition, and also that is motivating in itself. I actually think that's a good point, whether it's going well or not, always making the time to do something that's learning to you rather than it being a forced activity. I know, Eden, you enjoy reading, so
I'm a serial reader. That's what I would call myself.
But that might be your way of looking and learning, the same topics that, say, Mark, our colleague, could be watching on YouTube. I love a podcast, as we know. I come in with all my ideas. So however that looks to you in terms of learning, researching, whatever method works for you, make time to do that, because you're always going to be inspired, and with those ideas, you're going to want to drive them forward and take an action on them. So, I find that learning's quite motivating.
Yeah, And I think the ego in check thing, and I've seen it firsthand speaking to, and I find it quite often in high scaling growth companies where maybe someone joined relatively early on, and now we're building a TA team, or we're scaling quite a lot with designers, with product managers, software, etc. And they're really proud of what they've built, and they're all of a sudden doing 5-6 deals a month, getting the contract signed, and that's when all of a sudden they change. Their ego changes. They become somebody where they weren't like that in the time. So I've seen that, and it's happened a lot in the Berlin ecosystem. I'm not going to name names because obviously we're not going to start throwing shade at companies or anything like that. But but I do think keeping that ego in check and keeping grounded, and the journaling thing is quite interesting. So if you don't mind me just asking a little bit about that. So when we're talking about journaling, we're just taking a moment at the end of a day, a week, a month. How are we doing that to kind of then reflect back and at least kind of keep track of what we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it does in some. I think some people, unless you do it yourself, I think it sounds like a bit of a, well, I don't have time to do that task, but actually you can. I mean, I always do it in bed, for example. Before I go to bed, I always look at what I said I was going to do that day, and I cross-reference it. I check that what I've planned to do the next day is all fitting. I've got the time and allocation to do those tasks, or if anything's changed. And then I will just literally, it doesn't need to be war and peace. It's just a reflection of how my day's gone. How have I performed? As in, have I performed to 100%, or have I maybe had a bad day? And that doesn't necessarily mean that I haven't done the task that I've set out to do. It can mean that I wasn't feeling 100% that day.
Yeah.
It's kind of just being more self-aware of the conversations you've had that day. How have you dealt with certain scenarios? It's just kind of a chance to be more aware and self-reflective, just so that you can take those thoughts into the next day and be mindful of how you are. I think sometimes sorry.
I would say just that little check-in, and that sometimes that's enough to, I guess, as well, putting it to bed essentially. But like, you can finish today. I know, bad pun, but you can finish today knowing, okay, that today's finished. Now we're going to start again tomorrow. And I think in recruitment, I always use the phrase to my other half, we go again. I think that is, like, especially the last year or two, that's probably been the most used phrase at home, is if things go wrong, we go again. We just go again. And obviously you got to reflect, you got to learn, but there's no point in looking and holding on to what's been happening. We learn from it and we move forward, and that's motivating, I guess, from my side to say it's temporary. We just move forward. But easier said than done. And I do have the goals behind me to kind of have that. So I've got point one along my side. But things are going well. We keep our ego in check. We continue learning. We be mindful. We check in. We make sure that we're still optimal. But when things are going bad, that's when things can take a big turn. And I think that's what a lot of TAs have probably experienced in the last 2-3 years. And I think you were part of this process, right? Before joining into Peritus, you were a freelancer for a period of time, and obviously you saw how in demand talent acquisition professionals were, and then like 6 months later, it just came crumbling down. So how can we manage our mindset? How can we look at these long-term goals when things are not going great?
Well, I guess it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of like the to-do list, right? You keep adding things to it and you keep building the pressure. And that is kind of how a bad mood, a bad outlook, a negative experience happens. It's not just necessary. I mean, it can be one big thing, but more often than not, it's loads of small things that build up that make you feel overwhelmed and unable to cope. So taking it back to, and I don't really like to look at the negatives, but taking it back to basics and really, what is the worst case scenario? What's the worst that can happen here? And how can I make that work? What would I need to do to make the worst case scenario work? Anything above that is a bonus. And then you're kind of stepping into, okay, that's really basic. We want to be aiming a bit higher, but then you're kind of leaning into more of, I guess, gratitude, because you're looking at, oh, this has happened. Like everything then is a plus rather than I didn't get this, or a frustration, if you know what I mean. I think it's important to have a sounding board as well. I think I'm quite fortunate enough to have both you and Mark in work, but also outside of work, having people to talk about not just professional things, but, you know, personal situations, life happens. So having somebody to talk about those things with, and somebody that can hear you out, somebody that's also not afraid to tell you when you're wrong. I think that's important to hear outside of your professional life. But yeah, when it goes wrong, so to speak, I think there's a lot that you can peel back and start to look at the basics to get yourself back on track.
So you mentioned a few coping mechanisms there without using the phrase coping mechanism, and you mentioned one earlier. So let's say when things are going well and things are going bad, but, you know, we want to stay motivated outside of A, B, and C, and also outside of having sounding boards with people. What other mechanisms have you kind of adopted, or have you seen that works well for others that you would recommend, you know, those listening to kind of try, shall we say? Because what works for you might not necessarily work for me, and what works for me doesn't work for a listener, right? So it's about working out all these methods, take them. You're feeling in a position of highs and lows, but, you know, what other coping mechanisms would we be able to try?
I think it's weird because it's, for me, I kind of look at it not just as recruitment, but as mental health. I mean, I've kind of had my own struggles, if you like, in that space. And I think a lot of, and I do see and hear a lot of it from recruiters, from people that have struggled with anxiety, they've struggled with depression, and being in a high stressful work environment is just then like the nail in the coffin. It's just a bit too much. So generally and this is again back to my therapy days, something that they told me to do was write lists. So now I probably write too many lists now, but writing lists was one of the things of like the main things that you need to do. So that sort of ties in with the A, B, and C stuff, but also doing what, and this was when I was sort of my lowest. They kind of said, do what you want to do whatever you want to do, and however that looks, whatever makes you happy. And I still try to keep, I mean, obviously that's not, you know, an everyday thing. I can't just say, well, today I'm not coming to work, I'm going to go and do whatever I want to do. It's not realistic. But I still try to keep time. I prefer mornings because I'm an early riser. But I still try to keep time where I do something that is for me. Now, if you've got a tight deadline, you might need to work the odd hour or so over hours, fine. But generally speaking, waking up, working all day, working late, skipping your lunch breaks, and you know, going to bed to wake up and do the same thing all over again is not healthy. It's not sustainable, and it's not actually what's best for your company or for your work. So having that balance of doing something that's different. So I mean, this could be, I mean, obviously fitness is an obvious one, right? I enjoy going to the gym. Well, I say I go to the gym and for the mental benefits of it. But it might be sports. I don't know. You could be into tennis, or it might be that you've given up something. Like you, for example, you love bike riding, something like that.
Yes.
Fitting in 30 minutes, an hour of doing some form of exercise or something that you like, Pilates, reformers, yoga, whatever it is, even taking the dog out for a walk. And this is something that I think people always say, oh, I'm too busy for. Oh, I don't have the time. But whether you're a working mum, whatever your situation is, you've always got 20 to 30 minutes that you can go for a walk. You're contractually having typically an hour lunch to be able to enjoy and do what you want. Okay, you've got to eat in that time. There is no reason why you can't step out and take a stroll or a ride on a bike during that time. So I think physically getting moving definitely helps. Another thing I try to do, and I'm not by any means a life coach or a professional meditator or anything like that, and I don't actually know how to meditate, to be honest. I think that for me, when I started to look at it, it seemed quite complex, and I'm still learning. I don't know how to do it. But what I do like to do is take 10 minutes just to do nothing. So I'm I'm not looking at the computer. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not watching TV. 10 minutes every day sort of sets me up, and my mind just wanders. I don't know if I wouldn't call it meditating. So I feel like meditating is probably a bit more, has a bit more strategy to it than I bring to it.
To be honest, I've meditated a fair few times, and no, it's just about giving your mind space and not thinking necessarily about anything or judging thinking. That's more of the thing. Thoughts come and go, and it's about just allowing that to happen. So yeah, just sitting there for 10 minutes and just being is meditation. You don't have to sit in a particular pose. You don't have to have the rain falling. Do whatever you want.
I try to fit it in at the so I go to the gym, and then I try to do it in the sauna because I love to be warm. So yeah, that's kind of my thing. But again, that could be different for other people. I also enjoy cooking. So again, making time to, I have to eat. So coming home, doing some cooking. It depends. I think it's different for everybody. I don't think it's to say, oh, well, if you cook a meal, then you won't be stressed. You might be in a very frantic environment where there's lots of people shouting and kids running around, and there might be a lot going on, and you trying to cook is not relaxing. But that might then mean that you take an extra 10 minutes or half an hour at the end of the day to write or to draw, or on your weekends, instead of having back-to-back plans, trying to find some time to do something that's for you and what you want to do. Playing the piano, for example.
I haven't played the piano for ages now. I actually thought about this morning because I was playing that religiously before the little one arrived.
I don't know. As you're cramped your style there. I don't know if your listeners thought you was really cool up until then.
No, I hope so. I doubt it, if I'm honest. As you was talking there, though, I was thinking about something. I had a conversation, a lady called Felia who works for the team at Q Sales, and we were talking about lateral moves. And I also find that, from what you're talking about there, recruitment is a stressful job, right? Talent acquisition is a stressful job. No two ways about it, right? Let's just be transparent. We don't always have to move up. So if, for example, the goals that you're setting are always around promotions and how do I get to this and how do I get to this arbitrary title that people think I'm better, or if that's not going to make you happy, and this comes back to what you're saying there, do what you want. There's no reason, and in Felia's case, he is a phenomenal recruiter. And she's content being a phenomenal recruiter. She doesn't want the team. She doesn't want to run departments. She just enjoys doing recruitment. There's so many people that I know that, like in Berlin now and across Europe, from being part of this podcast, that don't have to always be aiming up. You can make those lateral moves, and you can set goals around lateral movements as well, because then it becomes a bit more about, and coming back to what personally right for you, what professionally, and that's where it blends the two together. But he was talking there about kind of taking those kind of moments to yourself and things like that. I was kind of, like I said, just thinking back to the conversation I had with her, and kind of blended the two of them together.
Yeah, I think it's taking that time to pull yourself, which is hard, to pull yourself out of the rat race and think, what do I want? What's important to me? What's the worst that can happen if this doesn't get done? That sort of grounds me, and then it's like, okay, ready to step back in. What can I do? And you kind of it's setting boundaries for yourself, for your time, and for your career as well. But yeah, just going back to the goals. Actually, I don't necessarily think that they need to be materialistic. I mean, they might be, but they don't necessarily need to be materialistic in the sense of, I'm going to be looking at the next promotion, or I want a fancy car or a nice watch, or whatever the typical things that they kind of standard they seem to be. It can also be about you growing as a person. So your targets might be how I can become, as I say, a better partner, a better friend, a better ally. What would I need to do that, and how in return does that impact my life? So I think it's just being realistic about where you're at and what your own weaknesses are, and how you can improve them. And
with that, we'll finish it. And I also want to say one thing. This is the first time we've had this deep conversation about this particular topic. Bear in mind, we've been business partners for several years now, and it's interesting because there's certain topics or certain coping mechanisms that I didn't know you were doing. So it's really beneficial for me to listen to as one, your business partner, and second, just as a listener in general. There's a lot that I can take away and try and implement. So I do appreciate you opening up and sharing that. And hopefully those listening as well might sit there and think, okay, how can I go about and implement some of these tips? And, what we'll do is we'll share your socials and people can reach out and, ping a message and kind of take the conversation further from there. But thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you. It's been nice to chat. I think it's great what you're doing here, and I think a lot of people are going to benefit from the series that you have, and I guess more worthy attendees that you have on, or speakers that you have alongside me.
Don't put yourself down like that. We're all good. We're all good. But thank you.
Thanks. Take care.